Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Miedzinski. I represent UNCTAD today. I work at the Science, Technology, Innovation Policy section at UNCTAD. I'm there at the short-term contract, working on their framework dedicated to conducting innovation policy reviews in developing countries. Before that, and after my placement I shall return to UCL, where I am working on the inno4sd project together with colleagues here. The session today you will witness or be part of the ongoing experimentation focused on new ways of evaluating and thinking about the role of public sector or public policy in supporting innovation for sustainable development. And in the project, we realized that the landscape, or analytical landscape of performing innovation policy reviews is currently in the process of change. So organizations like various UN agencies, as UNCTAD, as United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, UNESCO, OECD, and some other organizations do perform innovation reviews. However, they are rather traditional in their approach, and they all realize the need to adapt it to the 2030 agenda, SDGs, societal challenges, you name it. There is a realization that innovation policy needs to serve a higher purpose or respond to societal challenges. So today we'll first present to you a framework that we, together with colleagues from UCL and Union Merit, developed, that focuses on reflecting on innovation policies, taking into account sustainability. We'll start with presentation from Will McDowall. The presentation will follow, this presentation will be followed by presentations on 4 pilot studies on the UK, Turkey, South Africa, and Sweden. 2 of these reviews are very advanced, almost finished. 2 others are still very much in the process of being prepared. So we see this opportunity to discuss it actually as a part of the process. So it will be feeding into an ongoing reflection on the policy framework for science and technology innovations for sustainability. Following the presentations on countries, we'll have a policy panel. The policy panel will reflect on the framework, on the ongoing work, and hopefully help us in improving the framework so it can be useful for international organizations and other bodies that show interest in innovation policy. So we'll start with Will McDowall, who will present the framework to us, and follow the country presentations.
Great, thank you, Michal. Yes, so I'm going to quickly go through the way in which we've been thinking about how to assess innovation policies in this new world of the 2030 agenda, and in light of some of the things that Franz Burkhardt was talking about this morning. Very helpfully, and with absolutely no prompting from me, Franz's keynote this morning was setting out some of the conceptual background to the way in which we're thinking about assessing innovation policy. So he was talking about innovation as the product of an interacting, complex system of agents, ideas, rules, and artifacts, not just a simple product of scientific progress or the result of market demand. And in order to understand that kind of systemic process, we need a systemic perspective on innovation. And in the context of sustainability assessments, we need to be putting the idea of directionality at the core of that assessment. So thinking about how policy can direct this complex system and the outcomes of that complex system in a way that is meeting our collective objectives in terms of the SDGs. We also recognize that innovation policy assessment must be appropriate to the conditions and contexts of specific countries with very different challenges, different governance capacities, different needs, different innovation systems, etc. And we know that countries differ structurally in their innovation characteristics and in their innovation systems. So we need an assessment framework that is sensitive to that. And the final contextual point really is that much of the science, if you like, the knowledge around innovation policy, it remains contested. So there are things that people disagree about in terms of how best to pursue particular objectives. So that requires an approach that is reflexive and is able to step back and think about what it's doing rather than very prescriptive, simply providing answers on the basis, for example, of quantitative indicators. So that background has informed our process. And our process differs from traditional innovation policy assessments, those, for example, carried out by the OECD, or existing scoreboards, in that, first of all, it focuses on innovation policy for transitions, so for transformative change, not for incremental environmental innovation or for innovation in general. Because of that requirement for a contextually sensitive, reflexive approach, it is a participatory process that's expert-led, it's interpretive, situated within the specific context, and it's based both on existing quantitative indicators where they exist, but also on qualitative reflections on what those mean. And the process has the flexibility for countries to direct it towards the sustainability challenges of greatest salience to that country. We have a whole lot of theoretical background, which you'll be relieved I won't talk about. And we, through that process of understanding the theory of innovation systems and the contextual requirements, we've developed an appraisal criteria set of 12 criteria, which are up here. And these can be mapped broadly onto a classic policy assessment cycle or policy cycle. But many of them cut across multiple bits of that cycle, so we haven't constrained them solely to that framework. And they go from issues like the agenda centrality, so how significant a sustainability agenda is in terms of the public debate, the directionality with which innovation policy is focused on sustainability challenges, environmental policy stringency, so that's the extent to which environmental policy is really driving change across the economy because it's requiring difficult and stringent to meet environmental performance. We look at alignment, so that's the alignment, the degree to which diverse stakeholders within a country agree on and come together around a shared direction of travel. And clearly that's the kind of thing that is missing in most quantitative indicator-based country assessments, or indeed in many innovation policy assessments. But in the context of achieving sustainability goals, clearly it is important to understand the extent to which countries are achieving alignment around common goals and directions. We talk about legitimization, so that's the extent to which policy has a democratic social stakeholder mandate. We think about experimentation and demonstration, so thinking of innovation policy as something that is an unfolding co-evolution rather than simply the enactment of straightforward policies that lead to straightforward solutions. We think about specialization within a policy system, so the extent to which policy is able to direct innovation activities towards the most critical sustainability outcomes. We think about the coherence of policy, so obviously policies are consistent rather than pulling in different directions. The distributional impacts, so thinking both about the extent to which green innovation policy might lead to unfair social outcomes, but also thinking about the importance of bringing with you as a policy system various social groups that are needed to maintain alignment around common objectives. We think about effectiveness and as any policy evaluation would do. And we also talk about the extent to which countries are evaluating and learning from policy and policy experience in an ongoing way. So that's a very quick tour de force of the criteria. You'll be relieved to know that each of the country presentations is not going to slavishly go through each of those and explain how each country is doing, because that would take an enormous amount of time. But the thing I do want to highlight is the process for doing it, and we have these scorecards that help provide a depiction of what good performance looks like against each of these criteria. and these scores have been developed through this expert-based participatory process. And we score countries, and we also indicate the direction of travel, so the degree to which the country seems to be improving its performance or decreasing. So those are the 12 criteria, just with slightly more description to each of them, which I've run through. That was a quick tour of the process. I'm going to go straight on now to talk about the UK example, because I guess that probably this framework makes most sense when applied to a specific case. I'm not going to say much about the process for the UK review. We consulted a bunch of relevant policy stakeholders from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, from the UK's Innovation Agency, Innovate UK, and from elsewhere. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the criteria that I think are most interesting in this context, and provide some reflections on the way that this approach to policy appraisal is informing the discussion. So in terms of the specific policy criteria and policies that seem to be weaker in the UK, how well the framework is working and how useful the process has been. So in terms of context for the UK, sustainability and sustainable development in the UK have been to some extent overwhelmed by the UK's ambitious carbon targets. So in the last few years, the climate change agenda has been the big show in town in terms of the way that the UK thinks about sustainability issues. And that has both strengths and weaknesses, but it's meant that for this purpose, we've focused largely around the decarbonisation innovation for this process. So we have stringent carbon targets, and that's the overwhelming frame through which the UK has been thinking about sustainability. At the same time, over the last few years, we've had increasing concerns about the costs of energy. And the UK is, of course, an industrialised country with innovation leadership in some sectors, but also with long-standing problems with productivity and productivity growth. So we have a few sectors that are very strong performers and a long tail of fairly low productivity. And we've had very little productivity growth across the economy since the financial crisis. And one of the responses to that has been a new generation of industrial strategies, which signal a change in the way that the UK is addressing innovation and innovation policy from what 10 years ago would have been more or less unthinkable. The UK was very much a believer in the idea of setting some framework conditions and then letting the market get on with it. More recently, the UK has been taking a more interventionist, directive, enabling role as a state in terms of directing and enabling innovation. And in fact, just on Monday, the UK published a new strategy, new industrial strategy. There's been an ongoing process for that. And that strategy includes these grand challenges which are now used as framing devices for directing innovation policy supports, one of which is around clean growth, another of which is around mobility, both of which have important implications for the low carbon agenda. Others are the aging society, which is, of course, relevant in the context of SDG discussions. So that's some broad context. So how well do we think the UK is doing? So I've got a kind of a spider diagram, the idea for which I stole from my Swedish colleagues, who will be presenting theirs shortly. And you can see here that the two areas in which, this is the score from kind of 0 to 10 for each of these criteria, the two areas that the UK has done weakest at in our assessment relate to consideration of distributional impacts and experimentation. And so I'm going to focus on those in my remarks for the next couple of minutes. The experimentation criterion, again, is one that tends not to exist in traditional innovation policy assessments and has been actually one of the more difficult ones for us to assess. The International Energy Agency provides very useful data for OECD countries on energy R&D spending, public energy R&D spending, and helpfully, for my purposes, they separate the portion of spending that is dedicated to demonstration projects. And I've got that data here, the share of each country's energy R&D that is dedicated to demonstration projects. We've got Sweden and Turkey there. We don't have data for South Africa, unfortunately. The UK is the dashed blue line, and as you can see from that figure, it's declining, which is a pity, that the UK seems to be dedicating a lower proportion of its R&D energy research budget to demonstration. Actually, what's happened is that the amount of demonstration funding has remained constant, but the overall R&D budget has increased. And that seems a real pity, that we're not doing as much demonstrating of real-world technologies. And there is also a feeling within the UK policy system that we are not doing what might be conceived of as larger scale true experimentation rather than simply demonstration projects. So we are not doing enough in terms of trialing different mobility systems in cities, trialing different policy approaches to inducing sustainability in heating, for example. And we're not using experimentation sufficiently as a policy tool to both learn about and advance sustainability innovation objectives. The second issue that we think that the UK has performed less well on is on distributional impacts associated with the innovation policy objectives and processes. So the first depressing finding is that distributional issues are not always addressed in the policy impact assessments. So when the UK puts in place a policy, we have to do an impact assessment, and we are meant to include a consideration of distributional impacts in those impact assessments. But looking at those impact assessments, it's clear that that does not always happen, and where it does happen, the analysis is really quite weak and essentially useless in some cases. And yet, the costs of lots of UK energy innovation policies related to deployment are disproportionately borne by the poor because they're paid out of electricity bills. So we've got a transfer with, for example, solar PV deployment policies, transfer essentially from rich to poor, which is not ideal. Even worse, the UK tax regime overall is regressive, so anything that's funded out of the tax base is going to have a disproportionate impact on the least well able to pay in terms of the proportion of revenue. At the same time, though, some of our industrial policy in terms of supporting manufacturing facilities for low-carbon technologies has explicitly been targeted at supporting manufacturing plants in disadvantaged regions, supporting jobs in those areas. I'm going to talk very briefly about two of the areas in which the UK has done well, but in which we have a declining trend, because I think that's also important. And those are agenda centrality, that's how important this issue is on the public agenda, and alignment, the degree to which people agree on what's important. This is newspaper mentions of prominence in the national newspapers of eco-innovation, clean tech, clean technology, and it peaked around about the time of the passage of the UK Climate Change Act, and it's been declining ever since. This issue is dropping off the public agenda, and we have increasingly fractured debate about it. So to finish off, some key issues come out of the assessment in terms of what the UK is doing. We have fairly strong performance in some areas. We have weaknesses in policy evaluation, in experimentation, and in demonstration, and we've got some worrying trends around the degree of political consensus and stakeholder consensus around the direction of travel. In terms of how the process has worked, what was one of the interesting things in talking to stakeholders was that the things that they found most interesting about our framework turned out actually to be exactly the same areas as the ones in which the UK is performing weakest at. So policymakers thought, wow, this is great. We don't think enough about distributional issues. We really should be including this in our innovation assessments. We don't think enough about experimentation. This is really helpful. We need to be thinking more about how to assess and measure and understand experimentation with policy as part of an overall strategy for innovation for sustainability transitions. And also, we don't do evaluation well enough. We don't learn. When we do experiment and when we do implement policies, we don't learn from those sufficiently. I don't really have any time left. I mean, I wanted to flag that we have some conceptual challenges with this, the framework in terms of how we define and think about what is experimentation in particular, and just to observe that it's much easier to find good quantitative indicators for some of the criteria than for others. But actually, those ones that we don't have good indicators for are often those that are subject to greatest contestation, and for which highlighting them through this process is perhaps the most valuable. I'd better stop, because Michal looks cross. Okay.